I know we're one of the latest or last panels of a magnificent 2 days, so I just want to begin by thanking everyone for attending this sort of amazing gathering in Washington that's brought leaders from all over the globe, and to have this exciting and I think encouraging panel as one of the sort of last panels to send us off to do all the work that we're here to do. I want to just begin, before I introduce the panelists that are with me, by thanking the Atlantic Council for putting this together. It could not have happened at a more important time, given the conversation, confusion, and maybe mixed signals that we're hearing out of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and a place where people from all over the globe look for leadership. I think they've found it here at the Atlantic Council Conference, so thank all of you for what you have contributed. I also want to thank Senator Cassidy, Senator Hickenlooper, and Senator Coons for participating. I want to say I'm proud to have worked with these leaders for many, many years, and in particular with the Climate Solutions Foundation, which I helped to co-found a few years ago. And all three of these senators that showed up are active members of that bipartisan coalition on Washington, trying to find a way forward to advance durable, bipartisan energy and climate solutions for the globe. So I really wanted to thank them. Now, it's my honor to introduce our panelists in no particular order, but I'm going to start with Mike Catanzaro. I could go on and on. Mike has spent many years in Washington, is one of the go-to guys on this subject. But one of the positions that he held that was so important, he served as special assistant to President Trump for domestic energy and environmental policy at the White House, National Economic Council in the first Trump term. He started his career as a journalist, very knowledgeable. We're thrilled to have him. Josh Freed, here to my left, is Senior Vice President for Climate and Energy Programs at Third Way. Josh has one of the toughest jobs in town, along with me and others, trying to build bipartisan consensus on things. But for the last 15 years, he's led the Third Way's climate and energy programs, overseeing strategies to advance policies for the United States and allies working together to create and use independent clean energy systems to increase economic prosperity, ensure our national security, and protect democracy. Josh, thank you. That's a tall order. Next to him is, I'll go to Maria next. Next, across from me is Maria Korsnick, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Nuclear Energy Institute. Maria started her career with a Bachelor of Nuclear Engineering. Besides bringing a tremendous amount of policy experience, this leader has operated 5 nuclear reactors at 3 different nuclear reactor sites and is here to give us her views and expertise. And thank you for your leadership, Maria. And then finally, we have Tim Latimer, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Fervo. Tim started out in the oil and gas fields, brought his experience now to a new and exciting technology, and he worked also as a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. So he's been spending a lot of time on Capitol Hill these last few days. And so let me begin with you, Josh, asking a question. Our panel is really about the IRA and the future. You spend a lot of time trying to build consensus. The Third Way was actually instrumental in the drafting of that legislation. We know it's gone through many, many changes. That discussion is still underway at the Capitol, both House, Senate, and White House. So give us your views about overall, big picture, what's going on, what are you pleased about, what are you disappointed about, what are you hoping some of these outcomes might be?
Yeah, and so I think the key point to start with is the baseline of what Senator Manchin, who really did drive the development and underlying legislation that was and is the Inflation Reduction Act, was trying to accomplish. And recall, we went through the drama that's happening with the Big Beautiful Bill, I think still pales in comparison to the year-long drama in what happened prior to Build Back Better being renamed the Inflation Reduction Act, failing or dying and then getting resurrected. And it got resurrected after Russia invaded Ukraine. And Senator Manchin at the time, and has since repeatedly said, he saw the energy components of that as an energy independence and energy security bill. And that is very much how Third Way saw it in working with him and others in the Senate, and how we see the components of that bill still. And whether it's the manufacturing side, batteries, EVs, nuclear, the whole thing, it's looking at how does the United States generate as much energy domestically, manufacture it, and innovate it. The challenge now is all of these parts are in different ways facing a lot of uncertainty. We'll have to see what happens between the House version, which we were incredibly, incredibly troubled by, because even the parts that were being kept on were being rolled back so that, frankly, their commenced construction dates were so soon it was as difficult, if not impossible, to use, to a point now where we've got really good progress, particularly on nuclear, geothermal, and other areas. But it's still a long way between where it is today, getting it through the Senate, and then seeing how the Senate and House reconcile the differences between the two bills.
Thank you. Mike, let me go to you now. You've worked in the White House. You work closely with Republicans on the Hill, House and Senate. You just heard what Josh said about the changes that are being made as we speak to the Senate, moving from the House to the Senate. Do you see a difference in the way the leaders are looking at right now, the Republicans, an advanced energy economy? You know, is there a difference between climate action and advanced energy economy? Are they seeing some of the maybe opportunities that still lie ahead of us?
Yeah, well, first, thanks to the Atlanta Council. Thanks to you, Senator Landrieu, for this great panel. Yeah, I think with respect to Republicans, many Republicans on the Hill view action on energy policy and climate action as one and the same. I think they view a robust national energy economy when we're producing here in the United States all the above. That's a great thing because we're doing it better than everyone else. We're emitting less than everyone else in the rest of the world. So again, two sides of the same coin for them. I think when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously it was conceived in a partisan way, and you know, no one can really begrudge President Biden and the Democrats who had complete control of Washington, D.C., and they had a very clear idea of what they wanted to accomplish, and they went for it. And Republicans are doing the same thing now with reconciliation. You talked eloquently at the outset about the need for enduring bipartisan consensus on these issues. That comes from legislation now through regulation. And you know, again, hopefully we can get back to that, but when you pass legislation along partisan lines and very narrow margins, it's not surprising that then the next party will come back and seek to undo it. And so I'm hopeful nonetheless that we can get back to, you know, regular order, try to get to bipartisanship, which we had some of that during the Biden administration with the IIJA, with the CHIPS Act and other things. But I think there's a real opportunity here with respect to energy policy, permitting reform, you say advanced energy economies, maybe some R&D. There is a package that is there. It's going to be very difficult to get it, don't get me wrong, in the partisan environment we're in. But the needs are so acute, particularly on the grid, we have to move right now. We have very little time to waste given where we are.
Thank you for raising that point about the needs on the grid and the needs of producing more energy. That is really pushing the policymakers because of that push, and they can feel it in their individual districts, in their states. They hear their governors talking about where the electrons are going to come from. So that's got to be a bit of an incentive for both parties to try and find a way forward and try to find the electrons they need to build their districts. Maria, you've been in a pretty good spot with reconciliation. I think there have been some improvements made both in the House and the Senate. There seems to be bipartisan support growing for a nuclear renaissance in this country. And of course, the Third Way was very instrumental in many other groups represented here. But can you comment about, I know negotiations aren't over. I know the conversations are still going on, but what are the 2 or 3 most important things that are being adjusted, and what's the outlook for nuclear for the next couple of years in your mind?
Well, great. Thank you so much for the question, and I'll build on what Josh already put in play, and that is that the first, I'll say, version of the House was pretty tough on nuclear. And so we were really very concerned that it was not consistent with the conversations not only had we had on the Hill, but we had with the White House. And in that final stage, the manager's amendment, there were some changes to the nuclear pieces for the tax credits that were more favorable. And now we understand just earlier this week, it came from the Senate Finance Committee, and there was some additional improvements. So one example would be the version that came over from the House. You had to start construction by 2028 to get the credit, and now that's been adjusted to 2033 for full credit. If you start construction in 2034, you get 75% of the credit, and I think one more year you get 25% of the credit. So as the example to what Josh mentioned, when the early had to start construction by in order to get credit, was pretty tight. And so it's just an example of some things that are more consistent with what we need for nuclear. And I would say in a broader sense, regardless of the eaches that we could go through in the bill, it's a signal. It's a signal that the administration is very supportive for nuclear. Think about, they just gave out 4 executive orders. We can talk about those later. It's a signal that on both the House and the Senate side that there is continuing support. So I know it's tough these days to get much in the bipartisan nature, but you do still get that for nuclear. Another example was last year, the ADVANCE Act passed, and that was voted 88-2 in the Senate. Very few things that get 88 votes in the Senate. So I just want, a couple of data points there for people to appreciate that nuclear is still very much a bipartisan conversation.
And I'm going to come back in a minute to ask you about the current 90 so large reactors that we have, if my numbers are correct, and what may be some of the new SMRs and new technologies that are being developed, and how does that fit with our current fleet. But let me go to Tim. And I'm not going to let him brag so much up here about how much everybody likes thermal energy, but geothermal energy, but he's going to probably brag just a little bit. But Tim, tell us about, really seriously, we're hearing so many positive things from both sides of the aisle on this. The former Secretary of Energy, this was maybe her favorite subject, as we remember. The current administration is very positive. Our current Secretary, Wright, actually knows a lot about this since he personally invested in this technology and is very knowledgeable about it. So tell us why people are interested, excited. What is the true capacity of the United States on this? And does every region benefit from it, or is it just in certain areas like the West?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for hosting this conversation, and glad to be here. There's a lot to like about geothermal, and that's why we're enjoying broad bipartisan support now. It's a resource that can be developed relatively quickly. At our site in Utah, we're going to go from first drilling to electrons on the grid in under 3 years. It's a resource that produces in a baseload round-the-clock fashion. There's no carbon emissions, there's no fuel supply chains that you need to worry about. So whenever you start thinking about energy priorities or climate priorities or a national agenda on American competitiveness, it has everything that you want there. And on top of that, the technologies that we're developing at Fervo are building upon uniquely American innovation in the sense that we're adopting the horizontal drilling practices and hydraulic fracturing technology that unlocked the shale resource here in the United States as well. So it enjoys broad bipartisan support. And the potential is actually immense, but it has required new technology to get there. And to your point about, is it only in the West or can it impact other parts of the country? I actually think the broad perception for, more traditional style geothermal was that you had to have Iceland's geology or New Zealand's geology or Northern California's geology to make it work. And we didn't have the technology to expand beyond that. And so as a result, I think it wasn't in the conversation from a federal policy standpoint because it only impacted a few states, and the perception was that geothermal was sort of done. And so we used to joke that geothermal's always been bipartisan in the sense that neither party cared about it before. And we've now managed to make this great move, and actually we got some semblance of that. I can echo the comments about the bipartisan nature of nuclear and how that's been making its way through the One Big Beautiful Bill. In the House version that passed, actually did not get at first the same benefits of that last minute carve out that nuclear got. And it was almost like feeling deja vu, parties were being ignored again, because we pressed folks that we knew on the Hill, why not? And there's no opposition, right? It's just not top of mind. And so we were delighted earlier this week to see that the Senate Finance Mark included, rightly so, geothermal in the same conversation as nuclear, because they really solve the same American energy priorities. And so we are moving in that direction, and the real reason is because the technologies we've unlocked from being able to drill immensely deeper at a fraction of the cost and to enhance well productivity through these well stimulation techniques opens it up to be truly a 50-state resource. So we're starting in the West, because that's where the best geology is, but we are going to be quickly expanding this across the whole country. And the most recent report actually that just came out last week from the U.S. Geological Survey said, looking at geothermal through the lens of the advanced technologies that have been developed just in the last couple of years takes the potential up to 1,400 gigawatts in the country, not 50 gigawatts or 4, which is what we have on the grid now. And so that's why it's part of the conversation, is because there's been a technology breakthrough that has opened this resource up to true scalability for the first time.
One of the patterns, having spent a lot of time in Washington, 18 years in the Senate, I've watched year after year after year predictions that we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of gas, we're going to run out of this, we're going to run out of that. And every year we just defy those expectations because of American ingenuity and technology. And again, we can't depend on that. We don't have enough of it. Well, if you don't look, you won't find it. And when we look, we usually find a lot of resources that maybe we didn't realize we have. I think maybe this is another example of what I'm sharing. Maria, let me go back to you about small modular nuclear, because I think most people in the country are familiar with the large nuclear plants. You ran 5 of them on 3 sites. We have several, and Entergy does in Louisiana. I'm very familiar with our sites. I serve on the Evergy board. We have Wolf Creek, one of the best in the country. Tell us about small modular nuclears. How do they differ from our big ones? And what are some of the interesting technologies that you're seeing, and how do you think those will be used by industry, the small modular reactors?
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, maybe just to begin, when you say everybody knows about the large ones, I often find that they actually don't know how many large ones we have. So we have 94 reactors that operate here in the United States today, and they operate very well. We should be very proud of the U.S. fleet. It's had a greater than 90% capacity factor, which means the amount of time that it runs, greater than 90% for over 20 years. So it shows that we run and operate these plants extremely well. And the question is, okay, but as we look ahead, is it only the large reactors, or is there something else in the innovation pipeline? And I would say that innovation pipeline is chock-a-block full. Lots of things in there. There's new types of fuel in there. There is smaller reactors. She mentioned small modular reactors, and just for argument's sake, let's imagine that's something around, say, 300 megawatts. They vary, but let's just for argument's sake say it's sort of in that zip code. And then there's also microreactors, and microreactors are smaller than small. So think about things, in the maybe 50 megawatt or less kind of regime. And so what's interesting about that is, whereas in the past, if you thought about nuclear, you really just thought about gigawatt-size things. So you needed a pretty big thing to hook into because you have a gigawatt thing to plug, right? And now, all of a sudden, you have all shapes and sizes, various things, and so it's a fantastic time, honestly, to be in the nuclear industry, because it's like opening up all these new ideas and new doors of, oh, well, I didn't know I could use that. Think of the oil and gas industry. They have on their offshore oil platforms the need for a lot of diesel generators. They need the small chunks of power. Well, they're thinking about, why couldn't that be a microreactor, right? Could that be a microreactor? So they're investigating things like that. So even people today that are using energy in a different source, once nuclear comes in all these shapes and sizes, they're asking themselves, could that be nuclear? Be in a remote mining location and you want really reliable energy. It might be hard to get where you are. You might be in a place that you can only access certain months of the year because it's in such a remote location, right? Well, if you had a microreactor, it could would operate maybe 10 plus years on one load of fuel. It's incredibly attractive if you're in a very remote location. So her question is, well, how might people use this? I can tell you, it's sort of endless. People are really being creative about saying, wow, not only can it come in a smaller chunk of power, but I might be able to use it for a longer period of time before I have to add new additional fuel to it. Really, really very attractive. Some people don't just want the electricity, which is mostly what we're talking about here. They might just want high temperature steam. Maybe you're a Dow Chemical, and maybe you want that high temperature steam for your process. Well, some of these makes and models are going to make steam at like 900 degrees Celsius. That's pretty hot, okay? That's very attractive to some people depending on what you're manufacturing. So it's whether or not you want the steam, whether you want the electricity, maybe you want a little bit of both. You still need something even more energetic than that. Maybe it's hydrogen. Well, you can use these to make hydrogen and use that as your fuel source. So it's the reliability of nuclear that's really making it attractive as a solution set. And the fact that it comes in all these shapes and sizes lets you tailor it to whatever your business needs are or whatever your energy needs are. It's an incredibly interesting time.
And Mike, let me go to you, not to stay on nuclear the whole time. I'm going to shift in a minute. But because it's bipartisan and because this is we want to leave on a positive note, and there are many positive things. This is a bipartisan effort. Congress is making steps. There have been some investments made. When you were Domestic Policy Council advisor, how did you hear companies in America talking about nuclear as a source of baseload power? And how does that potentially support the growth of our manufacturing sector? Because Maria's right. We've all been focused on electricity, the grid, powering our homes, our businesses, but it's really the power sector, the manufacturing, the heat that's needed to produce our steel and chemicals. As domestic policy advisor, how did you talk about this and the importance for the U.S.?
Yeah, well, President Trump, going back to the first term, has been a strong supporter of nuclear energy. I worked on a civil nuclear review at the president's request, and we saw, Maria referenced the 4 executive orders that were just signed. So there's no question that President Trump and this administration is doing everything possible to get nuclear deployed as quickly as possible. And so I think, this bipartisan thing cannot be underestimated in terms of the significant momentum that it provides to nuclear, because other sources of energy have partisan headwinds, if you will, whether it's natural gas or wind or solar or coal. Nuclear doesn't have that problem. And the other thing is it checks the box, I think, for, the biggest issue we're facing right now is the increase in load growth from AI and data centers and electrification and onshoring from manufacturing. How are we going to meet that increased load growth over the next 5 years? It's probably going to be 2%. Increase year over year for 5 years. If that's to be believed. Even if it's half that, it's still a significant number. The way to do it, if you're a hyperscaler and say you have a net zero commitment, you have a 2040 commitment where you want to, again, get your greenhouse gas emissions down to zero, the best way to do that is to hook up to a nuclear power plant. Whether it's an existing plant, which is what we're seeing in the marketplace, which is really interesting, is these kind of new contractual developments between merchant power plants, nuclear plants, and Amazon and other, again, hyperscalers. But the new nuclear plants, what we really need to focus on, what I was focused on when I was in the White House, and I know this White House is looking at it every single day, is how do we get the permitting licensing process to be as expedited, as efficient as possible? I mean, I think if you look in SMR, maybe today, can it take 7 to 8 years? I'm very confident, however, that number is going to be reduced. Maybe it could be cut in half. Again, there is the will there to do that on both sides of the aisle. So that's going to be really important, I think, for new nuclear, is to, again, to get those permitting regimes much more certain, again, much more efficient and expedited, so we can deploy the new power we need on the grid as fast as we possibly can.
But yes, and I agree with you, but clearly here in America, and we've got resources in geothermal, but natural gas is sort of the most common base load that we're using, natural gas with renewables, added nuclear, all the above. So Josh, let me ask you, the Congress, it looks like the IRA, particularly the Republican modifications to it, are very focused on baseload. So let's talk about natural gas for a bit. We just had a great panel. The Governor Delaney talked about the tremendous opportunities for exports out of the U.S. We of course, we're all in the Gulf Coast. We're the largest exporter of natural gas now. Venture Global was mentioned. one of the largest exporters of natural gas in the world. We have lots of supply. How does that play into with baseload, with nuclear and geothermal?
Yeah, and one point I want to go back to that Mike made at the outset that I think is also really important is we focused a lot on the bipartisan successes, but unfortunately over at least the last 15 years, we've had a bipartisan failure, regardless of who's controlling Congress with regular order, as you had to deal with a lot when you were in the Senate. And I think if, to your point, if we can start going back to that and seeing both legislation pass through a regular order process, the opportunity to amend it, passing appropriations on time, a lot of the need for either party to do the reconciliation bills that create a lot less, more uncertainty around what our energy policy is, we'd be in a much better place more broadly. And I think that we sometimes go immediately to what the problem of the moment is on either side of the aisle and skip that important step of needing to return to a process that as it was intended and worked. I think, look, natural gas is an example of something that's currently working. We, with the exception of the LNG export pause in the last administration, we did see, even with President Biden, significant increases of natural gas development and deployment and growth on the electricity side, exporting. We continue to see that now. I think it's going to continue to play an incredibly important role, both domestically on the electricity side for manufacturing and also for exports, as both a way for the United States to support our allies, but also to continue to maintain economic growth. The question, though, that I think is starting to come into play is electricity prices in the United States are starting to rise dramatically. Natural gas prices are also starting to rise. We haven't seen all of the LNG export terminals at all come online that are going to. And I think policymakers of both parties need to just take that step back and look at how do we deploy all of the baseload, clean, firm technologies we need, and more broadly, frankly, also deal with questions about permitting reform so we get the transmission lines that connect generation to where load growth is happening, because we are going to face two challenges that I think voters are going to get very upset about. One is making sure that we have sufficient amounts of electricity for the economic growth in AI, manufacturing, and other parts of our economy that are needed over the next 20 years, but also doing it in a way that it does not contribute to the cost of living crisis that really upended the Biden administration. It's frankly upending incumbent governments around the world, and whomever is in office, if they're presiding over a time when energy prices go up, they're going to face a lot of political and economic problems, and we need to make sure that natural gas is a key part of the solution and that we've diversified sufficiently that we're not too reliant on any one fuel or technology.
Well, let me thank you for that and just add a little bit to this, and I'm going to get to this next round of questions. While it's not in the IRA, it's a basis of what's happening in the IRA, and that's permitting and the infrastructure necessary to deliver, whether it's geothermal, nuclear, natural gas, hydro, et cetera, pipelines, transmission lines, and other infrastructure necessary to deliver the promise of abundant, affordable energy to build an advanced energy economy for the world. So let me just say one thing, and I'm going to ask Tim about the permitting for geothermal. The prices of gas are going up, but in most places they're going up because of the restrictions of the pipelines to that region. So we pay very low prices for natural gas. Of course, in Louisiana, we produce a lot. We have the pipelines to support it. The Northeast and California is restricted. Their prices are higher. So it's just not only the cost of the fuel, which is relatively cheap in natural gas and plentiful. It comes to nuclear. While everybody's excited, there are costs associated with the building out of nuclear, which goes back to what was just said. But explain to us, Tim, the infrastructure necessary for geothermal. You still have to move by transmission line those electrons, right?
That's right. So we face the same limits to growth on transmission that any technology does. And that's kind of an overarching theme. We're not going to get the grid we need to meet our goals if we don't figure out transmission. And I'd say in addition to that, one of the more unique challenges that geothermal faces is, as you mentioned in your opening comments, right now we're starting our projects in the West. And the West is a little bit unique in the sense that the majority of the land in the states that we operate in is owned by the US government. And so almost by default, the fate of geothermal is deeply intertwined with the fate of NEPA reviews and the federal permitting process in a way that other resources oftentimes can develop solely on private land or just choose not to touch federal land. Geothermal, if we want to go to where the geology's right, we have to go through that full process. And this is something that we've actually seen. Part of the reason we are in this geothermal renaissance is bipartisan steps moving forward to significantly streamline that permitting process. And so, a review that was done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory when we started the company almost a decade ago showed that it was 7 to 10 years to normally permit a geothermal project because you have to do multiple successive NEPA reviews. And actually, there's a whole set of categorical exclusions that you got to drill oil wells on federal land that if you just said, okay, well, we're drilling a geothermal well instead of an oil well, you didn't get those categorical exclusions. So it was a much more significantly challenging permitting process than even developing oil and gas on federal lands. And we already saw some major changes in that. Actually, one of the, to speak about how bipartisan this is, one of the major actions from the Biden administration was to push through some of the common sense categorical exclusions that have been available to the oil and gas industry for decades into geothermal for the first time. And that happened right before the change. And we're seeing the Trump administration work with Secretary Burgum to build and accelerate that tremendously. And so there are some administrative things that are looking to shorten that timeline from 7 to 10 years now to more like 2 or 3 years. And we're also seeing bipartisan legislation being proposed. The great bill that got introduced last year was between Senator Heinrich and Senator Lee, who co-authored it, who don't often agree on energy policy matters, but they could come together and find a common ground when it came to geothermal permitting reform with the recognition that the fate of geothermal growth in the United States is deeply intertwined with the federal land use policies when it comes to NEPA reviews and regulatory processes. So we are already seeing from actions administratively taken by both this administration and the prior administration major improvements, and we really expect that we can get to a point where we can have robust reviews but are done in a 1 to 2 year time frame to develop geothermal projects on federal land in the near future through some of the legislative changes that we're optimistic about. So the picture is getting much, much better, and we would not be talking about a geothermal renaissance had the permitting story not already improved tremendously.
I'm going to ask a question about carbon capture and sequestration because it's sort of goes through all of this, a through line to Josh and to Mike. That is also seems to be bipartisan to some extent. Democrats supporting it because they want to reduce the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas. Republicans support it because they see it as a economic, security, national security. Can you talk a minute about the bipartisan nature of carbon capture?
Yeah, and I think to go back to a little bit of what we were discussing before we came on stage, there is some Democratic support for carbon capture, but honestly, I think there needs to be more. We do see from some environmental groups on the left and members of both the House and Senate that are more on the left in much safer blue districts who oppose it because they also believe that continuing to support any natural gas, any use of oil is a slippery slope. And frankly, I think that opposition needs to reflect on reality. The energy that we have, whether it's fossil fuels, nuclear, geothermal, but particularly fossil fuels, it's very energy dense, it's very affordable, it's very transportable. It's going to be here for a very long time. And we are missing an opportunity if we don't continue to invest, embrace the bipartisan support, and accelerate the deployment of carbon capture because otherwise it's going to stay on the grid and on the system and just continue emitting as it currently does, which would be a big mistake. And so there's an opportunity here. It's done very well with the Senate updates to the reconciliation bill. It's always had strong bipartisan support, including from Louisiana and other places. It's one of those places that I think could follow a little bit more on where nuclear is and geothermal is and have that broad base of bipartisan support and move forward even more quickly with more funding than it's had.
Mike, let me ask you that, because I know there's a question about the cost of everything, and the Republican Party, and particularly Secretary Wright, has been saying, we're going to do everything that's cost effective, that works with the market, that can pencil, quote. So nuclear can be expensive. Geothermal is, we'll see what the cost comes out, but it's new. People don't know how it's going to pencil exactly. We have some experience, of course, a lot of experience with oil and gas, but how do you see the administration on carbon capture? And that's been a modification to the improvement, I would say. Josh would say, others may disagree, but in the IRA.
Yeah, I think, certainly with respect to the IRA, the 45Q tax credit is absolutely essential to get these CCS projects up and off the ground, and it does have strong bipartisan support and has support from some leading Senate Republicans, from Senator Capito, chair of the EPW committee, from Senator Barrasso, who's the number 2 in the Senate, from Senator Kramer and Hoeven and others, and Secretary Wright, frankly, in North Dakota, was a strong supporter, still is, of the Project Tundra CCS plant there. There's a lignite coal plant, and they have a very, I think, promising CCS project that hopefully comes to fruition. So there's a lot of support for it in the Republican ranks. I think this administration is going to be supportive of it, and I think particularly from the permitting perspective. I think you're going to see EPA especially getting more aggressive in allowing states basically to have more delegation or delegated programs with respect to the Clean Water Act and get in their Class 6 injection permits, which is a really, really critical sort of threshold thing that you need to get things going on CCS in the states. The permitting challenges, though, not to be diminished. Even with this administration trying to do everything that it possibly can, which they are doing, you have multiple steps in a very long process here. CCS is very complicated to permit. And the environmental community, unfortunately, I think there's very little, if any, support for carbon capture projects. And so unless we have really robust legislation on permitting reform, they will continue, I think, to try to block projects. And in some cases, unfortunately, I think they're going to be successful. So again, if we want all of these different technology solutions to come to fruition, this permitting reform piece, I can't stress it enough how essential that is to get that legislation over the finish line.
I think everyone in the room would agree with that. We've got 5 minutes. We're going to do our last minute each. Maria, starting with you. Something that I didn't ask you want to say or you want to underscore?
Just to say that I think it's a new day for nuclear. You mentioned the view that nuclear is expensive. I would tell you the nuclear plants we have today were justified on a 40-year life. They've gone from 40 years to 60 years. We're now permitting them from 60 years to 80 years. There's nothing magic about 80. I think we have to be more thoughtful about the long-term strategic nature of these assets. And I would tell you, anybody that has an operating nuclear plant today is really glad that they have it. In fact, some that we have shut down, we're going to restart because they wish they hadn't shut them down. And I think it really builds the strong case. If you look at around the world, any countries that had a sustained nuclear build, South Korea, Japan are 2, they got better and better and better and better. I would tell you we don't know what it costs to build a nuclear plant here in the United States because we don't do it enough. So I think that's really what's in our future. We just got to get on, we got to start building, and we'll get better and better and better. And I think then we'll have an idea of what the actual cost is for that nth of a kind, and I think we'll be surprised. I think it's going to be very much part of the affordable energy mix that we'll have. Bottom line is we are interested in these tax credits. We're very appreciative of what both the House and the Senate have done, but it's not over yet. So we have a lot of attention on the tax credits and also the Loan Program Office. I think that's an important part as well. So we're still out there working it every single day, but we do appreciate both the House, the Senate, and the White House for all the work that they're doing leaning in. Thanks.
Tim, 1 minute.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from our industry is that geothermal's here and it's real and it's happening now. It's not just hype for no reason, it's hype because there's substance here. And we're moving incredibly fast. We brought our first project onto the grid in 2023. By next year, our project in Utah, Project Cape, 500 megawatts, will start producing first electrons in 2026. And there's a lot of more projects to come in the pipeline. And because we are so adjacent to the oil and gas industry, we're using the same drilling rigs, the same crews, the same technology manufacturing. that is an industry that knows how to do things at scale, and we can flip a switch and bring that equipment and services into the geothermal industry. And so the pace of takeoff here is going to be tremendous, just because we already know how to do all of these things by being, just one step removed from what the oil and gas industry already does at global scale.
Which is a good talking point to Democrats. Talk to the oil and gas industry about what the present and the future might look like, and stop not talking to them would be the message. Go ahead,
So
Josh.
3 things to keep a watch on. One is a provision that is still in the reconciliation bill called foreign entities of concern.
Yes.
It is adding layers of bureaucracy that should make the people at DOGE's hair stand up. We need to make sure that our technologies are secure in the United States, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't potentially stifle a very significant amount of deployment of critical, innovative American technology. We need to get batteries in electric vehicles back to the same point of bipartisan support that geothermal and nuclear have. The idea that Brazil, Thailand, and a whole bunch of other countries are going to surpass us in EV deployment, and it's all going to be driven by China, should scare the living daylights out of everyone, and it's a national security concern. Don't worry about the environmental side. Just think about what batteries are doing in transportation right now. And then the last thing is Senator Cassidy's carbon accounting bill. I think that's one of the next places where we might have a real bipartisan glimmer of support, where the U.S. can take the lead in determining what the carbon intensity of different manufacturing processes are, and it can be a U.S. standard rather than a Chinese standard, and that has bipartisan support.
Thank you, Josh. Mike, last word.
Yeah, I think Josh makes an excellent point on this FIAC issue, and I think one thing to be looking for is, once this bill passes, and I'm very confident eventually it will pass, because if you're a Republican, it has to pass. You have no other choice but to get it done, and they will get it done. But when you read through the language on FIAC, when you think about the language on commence construction, the Trump Treasury Department will be very key in terms of how they interpret that language. They're authorized to do guidance on those things, and how they determine that, I think, can be very impactful, particularly for the wind and solar industry. So we'll see where that goes from there. But I know there's, if you're in the wind and solar industry, you're probably looking at this bill and saying, gosh, this is really bad for us. Maybe if you're Democrats, you're saying, wow, the IRA is being unwound. This was President Biden's top legislative accomplishment. But I see opportunity in it, because as we were talking at the outset, maybe I'm naive to think there's an opportunity for bipartisan legislation here on some of these issues, but this could be just a bargaining chip, I think, for Democrats going forward, and even some Republicans, to get maybe some of these credits back into the mix. Transmission is an issue that absolutely has to be addressed. That is central to getting to a bipartisan bill on energy and permitting reform. But on the permitting side of the ledger, if you're a Republican, you have to be advocating for a bold overhaul of the system. We cannot be going through it, legislation by legislation. There's probably 18 different statutes that impinge on the process. It can't be fixed that way. It has to be completely thrown out. You have to start over again and go to a permit by rule type system. Again, that's a big, bold decision to make. But again, I think you could sit down at the table and get some of these credits and transmission policy changes into the mix and potentially get legislation. And again, as I say, I'm optimistic because the need is there, the urgency is there. This is so critical for the future of the country, that we have an affordable, reliable grid each and every day for all that we do.
Well, thank you all for your insights and your thoughts, and I think we can leave by saying there's some threads running through the negotiations of the IRA that give us hope for the future, some opportunities in the future for bipartisan, durable congressional action to build the advanced energy economy this country needs and the world is looking to our leadership for. Thank you all. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks.